Specificity matters. Specificity of training matters. What you have here, this is Dr. Miller here with another download information. Hope you're finding my videos useful. If you like what you hear and you're interested in learning more, variety of topics in fitness and sports training and strength conditioning and hypertrophy, nutrition, subscribe to the channel. There's a whole bunch more of this information out there. I'll work on the lighting. I know the lighting in my videos is terrible. I need an intro video as well. I need to jazz things up a little bit. I hope the content, though, more than makes up for it. So this video, let's get to this video here. Specificity of training, and you know, if you've been watch some of the videos, you know my favorite two words are it depends. It depends on the situation, the individual, to determine how training can look. And many times, though, people are interested in all three of these training qualities in front of you. I'll call them the big three here. There are other things, of course, that are important. I'm not saying these are the only ones, but in general, especially when it comes to the barbell, these are three areas that many people are interested in. Obviously, there's some subcategories we could tail off in here, like weight loss and things like that. Obviously, I have mobility on here and flexibility and all these different categories that, you know, would be in that realm of movement quality. And not to say these aren't movement quality as well, but I wanted to tackle these three big, you know, barbell concepts, though, and just give some general advice. And I use the angle of specificity here because there are specific things that are you know for each one of these qualities, and I kind of listed them out here. So I'm going to go through these real quick. Stop talking in circles and actually get to it. First thing is strength, and then hypertrophy and power. So hypertrophy is, of course, gains in size. And are all three of these variables intermixed? Of course, if I arrange this slide a little bit better, I went hypertrophy, strength, power, you'd have a linear periodized model for an athlete, perhaps a power athlete, field court sport athlete. You can, you know, arrange these strength and power back and forth for somebody even interested in gaining mass. And you might not have a lot of strength blocks, but you might have some. Somebody who's just trying to get to the gym and improve their physique or improve their general wellness, fitness. Again, you might have all three, probably more so in the strength and hypertrophy, probably hypertrophy more than strength. And so, you know, again, these are blocks that you could arrange in a training program. That's for another video. But what are some of the specific qualities of each one? So if you're trying to strength train, it sounds so, you know, silly, but lift heavy things. And so if you lift heavy things, we're talking about the intensity of training now. That means that you might be working down into repetition ranges that you're getting the 80% if you're a trained person. If you're just starting, it may be 65% of your max. Or if we use the RPE, you know, 6 to 7 out of a 10. If you're somebody who has been well trained, you're in the 8s range all the way up to potentially maximal. You notice I said mostly not to failure. I wouldn't go to failure unless you have a purpose for doing so, like a competition or you're training for a competition. Otherwise, failure, remember, accrues fatigue. And when you're talking about trying to build strength or any of these qualities over time, the more fatigue mounts, the more you're going to have to take down the load or take elongated rest periods or take days off from training when you could have been building out one of these things, whether that be heavier lifting or more volume. So mostly not to failure, lift heavy things. That's going to dictate lower rep ranges. The last one here is very important, and that the last point on all of these is probably the most important that people forget. They understand maybe lift heavy things and not to failure maybe is a good idea. Some people tend to do that too much. But move them, the heavy things, that's what them is, with the intent of velocity. So the quality of the movement still is good. So even if you're lifting a bar that's 95% of your max, or a 9.5 on the RPE scale, okay, or 1 to fail with a really heavy load, however you want to arrange it, your intent still should be to move that bar as fast as possible. So let's say it's a back squat and you're coming out of the hole and that bar looks like it's going, you know, about as slow as I can run. Doesn't matter. It's your intent. It's the neuro drive that is important, and it's going to incur more strength gains than if you didn't. Now, that doesn't mean that heavy bar and that peak force that's going to be required for you to move it isn't going to make you stronger. But if you really want to take advantage of the situation that you have where the heavy bar is on you, move it with intent. So that means you have to be focused. I'm big into every rep matters. Every rep matters. Every one of them. Don't just Do reps, okay? Train, okay? Train with intent. So move the barbell. The second one, hypertrophy. Lift heavy to moderate light things. So what does that mean? Run the spectrum of loading. Okay. Now you probably won't spend a tremendous amount of time in heavy things. Heavy things being, again, let's say the dividing line is 5 to 6 reps per set with 2 to fail or so, or roughly into that mid 80s range. Okay. And the reason you won't do a lot of that if you want to do hypertrophy is because although the intensity matters to a degree, it's really the volume that has the biggest determining effect with hypertrophy. At least that's what we think does right now, and it probably has some merit. I mean, it makes sense in terms of tissue breakdown and tissue reconstruction. You got to break down more tissue if you want to see advancements in that tissue's growth. And so, if you go heavy, it's going to limit the amount of volume you can do. It's going to beat you up. It's harder to do 10 sets of 3 than it is 3 sets of 10, just by the nature of the load, if assuming that you're matching the load to the repetitions with 2 to fail or whatever it may be. And so, yes, you might do some heavy training in the block. Heavy training will hit those type 2 fibers, the big fibers, and I think that has value. You might do this in a phasic week, so you might have a heavier day and then a moderate day, or a moderate day and a light thing, a moderate to light. And I said moderate to light. I hesitate to use the word light. I know there's been research that supports doing, these really high RMs, like a 20 RM. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but for most people that may not be the best range. Okay, now there could be times to phase it in and out, but I would say that's probably infrequent. Okay, and my reasoning behind that is because the type 2 fibers are the ones that are going to grow the most. Now, this is where individualization also comes in. If somebody's mostly type 1, there may be more benefit for them to spending time in those high repetition range sets. But there's a fine line between the hypertrophy that's occurring at those ranges and then just getting a lot of metabolic fatigue that, yes, can stimulate growth, but it starts to look more like endurance training. And so, if I sound kind of wandering the woods, it's because that's kind of where it is physiologically too. Well, you're really endurance training when you're getting at those high repetitions. Yes, you're breaking down tissue, but a lot of it will come down to, that last one on the slide on this point is the connection you have with the muscles. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing these high repetition sets. I just wouldn't do a lot of them. I would rather, and some of this is opinion as well, so you can chuck it if you don't like it, and it's certainly individualized. I would rather see an addition of a set than just to push out the 20. Now, when I train people, we'll do especially light dumbbell circuits. I think they're valuable to work in, especially if somebody's been working with barbell for a long period of time, to work in these cycles that are dumbbell only, because it just gives more range of motion. That's why dumbbells or cables can be worked in. Just gets people moving at these high repetitions. You burn a lot of calories. It's great tissue prep because a lot of growth hormone release, and it unloads the spine and some of these joints that have been really compressed a lot with barbell work. It's just a nice variety cycle, but it's not a cycle I would continue over and over and over and over and over again. Okay. If it's determined somebody's a little more type 1, and how do you determine that? We'll watch them lift and move and their challenges with gaining mass. It's possible that they may benefit from more of these moderate to light repetition ranges, but again, you have to be careful because it starts to turn endurance. And somebody who's really a metabolic machine, you do some of these high rep sets, and if they're not feeding properly, they're not eating properly, the nutrition is off, you just turn into an endurance session, and that's going to make it harder for them to gain mass. So I just tend to stay out of those high repetition range things. It doesn't mean that I'm right. I have some physiological basis for what I'd say, but there's also some studies that would say that it's okay to work into a 20 RM to a 30 RM, and you can still see benefit. I would just say for most people, getting to those big fibers is the goal, and so staying in between, and not a lot of time at 5 reps either, 5, 6, but staying in that 5 to 15 rep range. The old school 8 to 12 range, I still think has merit. The more I see this, the more I return back to that. Again, it's not to say you can't go on those tips of heavier and super light. What I would say super light, it doesn't mean that there isn't times to do it. Like during the, right now during the quarantine that had existed, or some exists for some still, and there's a limitation on equipment or band work, or that's all you have, then high reps of course make sense. I mean, that's better than nothing. I'm saying if you have a full gym at your availability, what's the best range to work in? I would still stick in that 8 to 12, 15 rep range for most of your sets and add sets as you go rather than keep extending out the repetitions, occasionally doing cycles with high repetition sets. Okay? And so that's my recommendation. It doesn't mean I'm right. There's more than one road to Rome. There's lots of ways to do this. And it's going to, you know, every individual, somebody could say, I found great success with 20 RM training. Great, keep doing it. Like, just because I, in general, don't think it's the right approach doesn't mean it won't happen for you. All right, mostly not to failure. Now, this also has a caveat, and if you've seen my other videos, you know, what are we talking about exercise-wise? If it's a single joint exercise, you could go to failure more often, but you still got to plan it. You can't go to failure every set. You want to make sure that you have a deload in mind. And if you're really training a lot of volume, you will need a deload. I know people say deloads are stupid. Well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're really ramping up some serious volume, you need to back off for a week or a couple days at least to let your body recover. Okay. Again, this is another reason, you know, when we talk about failure, not to go on these heavy loads, high intensities very often, because it's a lot of compressive forces. Now, you know, the other side is when you do more reps, you get more exposure. So, you know, it's going to beat you up less though to stay in that old 8 to 15 rep range. So mostly not to failure, certainly not on compound lifts like a back squat or even a bench. I would stay away from it just because the fatigue is so high. You know, yes, you get a pretty awesome stimulus, but if it, you know, if you're right before a deload week, maybe. But if you still, like, you do a heavy bench and max out on a Tuesday and you still want to do some chest work later in the week, it's going to be hampered still by that maximal chest exercise, whatever it was, of seated, you know, plate loaded seated press or whatever it is. And so I would be very careful with going to failure. What's important with hypertrophy is connection. So we talk about this mind muscle connection. Some of those exercises are really hard to do that. Like a biceps curl, it's easy. Like you do a good drag curl, for example, man, you can squeeze the heck out of your biceps at the top. But it's harder to do in a DB row until you have some experience and you start to feel the blade moving and be able to contract those muscles that are moving. So what I would say is do your best. What I would say is, in relation to that though, is don't just put in volume. Don't just move loads. And I'm guilty of this too. Just crank out 12 reps and like, oh, cool, that was awesome. You didn't really connect to the exercise. You were swinging the weight, whatever it was. I mean, make the muscles work. Put the tension on them and leave them on the tension. Stay in control the whole time. That's what I mean by connection. And lastly, power. I'll try to make this video a little bit shorter. Sorry, I've talked too long already. I hope you find this interesting. You know, power, lift throughout the spectrum, mostly specific. Now, what do you mean by lift through the spectrum? The spectrum of loading. So in more intensity here than volume. And so you might lift, you know, with power in mind, you might lift 80% in a clean or something like that, or do a squat with power in mind with 80%. Now, how many reps to failure you do that 80% is important. So if, let's say, you can do 80%, you know, 4 repetitions with 2 to fail, or if you went to failure, roughly 6 reps, you may only do 2 reps. But the idea is that the quality and the intent of velocity, that's what I've said the last point, is what's important. Move the barbell with velocity. The whole point is power. Okay, power is force times velocity. If you've done some peak force work already, you're focusing on power now. The variable you're probably focused more on is the velocity component, especially if you're going to use this for sport. And so when I say run throughout the spectrum, you might do exercises where it's just your body weight, like jumping is the optimal. The optimal load for jumping is your body weight. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do a jump squat with 20% of your, you know, squat max or something like that. But that just means that, you know, the optimal load is your body. So you might run through the spectrum at that though and go 10%, 20%, right? That could be the spectrum. The clean, you know, depending on, you know, what your technical proficiency is, you may not go heavy anyway. But let's say you're awesome at doing a hang clean, you may run through a spectrum of ranging as low as 50% of your clean max, or 5 out of 10 on an RPE scale, all the way up to 8, maybe even 9 if you can still move with technical proficiency. Okay, so that's the same move the spectrum. Now the question is, what do you need? What are you moving? So when I say mostly specific, if you are a rugby player or American football player, or even a basketball player to some degree, where you're going to be moving other bodies other than yours, let's say, or combat sport or something like that, you may range up into heavier loading because you're going to move something else other than you. If you are moving yourself mostly, in my opinion, there's no reason to train up into the higher percentages. So if you only move you, working in as high as 75% at the very most, like in a power type of situation, is beneficial. Again, some of that's my opinion, some of that's looking at optimal power tends to occur in most exercises. On average, there's a lot of caveats there, at about 60% of your max. And so, if you are a soccer player and let's say you only move you, then you don't need to range up into these heavy loads. Now you can still do peak force work through heavy squatting and things like that. But when you do power specific things, that's what I'm getting at. Move more on the velocity end of the spectrum than on the force end of the spectrum. Again, if you're an offensive lineman in American football, you might move on the more forceful end. And so you might move in the 80s and 90% potentially if you're technically proficient in some of these exercises that are more power specific. I'm thinking like a clean here. Okay. Now that doesn't mean as an offensive lineman you still got to run, you still got to sprint without somebody on you, still doing like a speed squat or running the spectrum like I mentioned before here, like 60% cleans is not a bad idea, or doing some snatches at 60% one day and then do some heavier type cleans on the next. That makes sense because that's who you are as an athlete. That's what your requirements are for your sport. But if you're a volleyball player, I don't see any need needlessly loading yourself in these higher percentages in power situations. I don't see any need to do that. Okay, if you know that you're going to jump a lot, take it. You can do cleans in the 60s percent wise. That could be your average intensity. If you're going to jump a lot, you could range up and down with jump squats, or dumbbell jump squats, or eccentric box squats, or something like that, or eccentric box jumps, excuse me, or something like that. That makes a little more sense for your sport. So it's not a one size fits all. Now, the last thing here, notice it is the intent to move though. If you're doing a speed squat, you can't just do 60% of your max on the bar and be like, oh, la, la, la. Even if there's chains on or anything else, it doesn't matter. You have to have that burning desire to move as fast as you can. Same with the clean. You can't just muscle the clean and just get through there, there has to be quality of movement. So when I say every rep matters, it is so important in all three of these that the quality of movement, maybe with different focus in the mind, but the quality of movement is paramount. So a lot of times we talk about training programs and how we structure this and how we do that. If the quality of movement is terrible, you're going to lose some of the benefits of the program. Maybe even significant benefits of the program. If you're trying to gain hypertrophy and you're just swinging weights around and you're going to failure, you're getting crushed, and you're not seeing the volume progression while maintaining load or holding load somewhat constant, you're not seeing the quality and movement, or you're not seeing the type of progression you'd like to see. Again, if strength training is done just lackadaisically, and there's no intent of velocity, and you're going to failure and picking 50, that's not good. Power, if you're just getting through the rep, that's not going to be helpful for power. Power in particular, if you're not trying to go as fast as you can, you're just wasting your time. Okay, you might as well do some conditioning. And sometimes that's what it turned into for some people. All right, that's enough. Hope you found this valuable in application of your training. But this is not, I don't think this is some sort of perfect standard. There are things and nuances we could argue over, absolutely. But in general, this is a good way to think about these things, I think. You could disagree with them. And again, there's things that we could add and take away here, of course.